Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
We've got a little bit of follow-up from our last episode on enamel. We spent the entire episode talking about Namikawa Yasuyuki, and I ended up mispronouncing his name early on in the show, which meant that Jon mispronounced his name through the show as well. The pronunciation that we used in the last episode is incorrect. It is Namikawa Yasuyuki. We also misattributed the upcycled Apple Watch. It was in fact made by Till Lauderman, and Matt, the watch nerd, confirmed that it is a fully functional watch. And we have updated the show notes from last episode with the correct information, the correct link for Till.
Baselworld 2018 just wrapped up, and despite being shorter and smaller than it has been in more recent years, we still got hit with a fire hose worth of timepieces. I thought it'd be good for us just to touch on some of the ones that stood out to us. We certainly won't touch on every single watch, because it's just not at all within the realm of reason.
Absolutely. There are just too many watches that come out of these shows to reasonably be able to discuss them. It is also a bit odd because SIHH wrapped up in January, and from the other industries that I'm in, it feels weird having two large shows like this for the same industry back to back. What are the significant differences between these two shows? Because I think for an outsider looking at them, it would be easy to confuse what these two shows are, since many of the same brands show up at both of them.
No, there are two very distinct shows. Now, there is some overlap with the independent watchmakers, and that's simply because, number one, they have traditionally exhibited at Baselworld because they collectively together pay for a booth, because in most instances, an independent watchmaker wouldn't be able to afford to have a booth at Basel. So they band together under the Academy of Independent Horologists and rent out a booth there. And just last year, they were invited for the first time to also exhibit at SIHH by the organizers there. SIHH stands for the Salon International de Haute Horlogerie, which is effectively high-end horology, so that's one of the big distinguishing factors. Just how merited that sort of distinction isn't particularly valid. Basel's much more broad. The genesis of SIHH is more so lies with the Richemont group and their brands. So that's why you'll find it is dominated by all of the brands that fall under their umbrella. So you've got Cartier and Lange & Söhne, Jaeger-LeCoultre, and whatnot. But they have been wooing more and more brands away from Basel over the years, Hermes being one of the more recent ones this past year. Hermes showcased at SIHH rather than Baselworld. And I didn't attend SIHH, but I'm almost curious whether that means that also means that for the very first time the Apple Watch appeared at the Salon International de Haute Horlogerie, because they are in partnership with Apple for a number of timepieces. So I would imagine, being a watch show, that Hermes would have shown off their smartwatch, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
Yeah, that would have been interesting to see, since it's such a change from the traditional watch world, and has been derided by much of the traditional watch world. So it'd be interesting to see if it showed up and how it was received.
Mm-hmm.
I know it certainly didn't get any coverage in the main watch press. So
yeah, well, wouldn't have been anything new announced there.
No,
in that respect. So not really newsworthy, but it could very well have been in a showcase there. But speaking of haute horlogerie or haute horology, that isn't to say there's any sort of dearth of haute de gamme pieces at Baselworld. In fact, you'll find some very high-end pieces there, some of which we'll get to a little bit later. But one I thought would be good to touch on, just sort of transitioning from our episode last week where we spoke in depth about enamel dials. Did you happen to see the pressage automatic from Seiko with the Shippo enamel dial and the guilloche patterning underneath it.
Yeah, I did get a chance to see this, and I'm incredibly impressed by this watch. The Seiko designs I find to be pretty conservative. They don't tend to change the design dramatically from year to year. They haven't strayed very far from sort of their original designs. They often aren't doing anything crazy with their cases. But this is an interesting dial. This one's a blue enamel dial, and it is a hard enamel that they're doing with it. The Shippo technique I am not at all familiar with, and just from the quick press releases that I've seen, it looks like this is a traditional style of enamel work that's being done in an area of Japan. And I honestly don't know what the differences are between it and other forms of enamel that are out there. But they are doing an enamel dial. I suspect that is not a hand-cut guilloche pattern. It's probably using some mass production technique like stamping, because this watch is, I think it's retailing for $1,400 US.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I don't know how it would be possible to do a hand guilloche dial with enamel for $1,400, let alone put that on a watch for $1,400. So it's a beautiful looking watch. I would love to see one of these in person. And based on what I know about Seiko's manufacturing and their movements, I suspect this is a steal for the price that they're charging for it.
And just as a comparison point, how much do your pens go for with the similar technique?
Well, I think my guilloche and enamel pens started around $3,500 US. Now, of course, I'm not making them in the quantity that they're making them in, and I'm making them one at a time. But still, they probably have a number of workmen who are working on these dials at the same time. But still, it's an impressive feat being able to produce a watch, an in-house watch like this with a beautiful guilloche dial with enamel for that price. So,
I agree.
Hats off to Seiko for figuring that out. It also looks like they're printing the dial on top of the enamel. So many of the enamel dials that you see out there, whether it's from Kari Voutilainen or Vacheron Constantin,
the Gronfeld brothers,
when you see a lot of the traditional enamel dials, the numbers are often either on a separate band from the rest of the dial, or they're separate physical pieces that are mounted onto the dial, which takes significantly more work and effort to make. These ones have clearly been printed onto the dial, and I'd be curious to know if they have been printed in enamel or if they are just printed with an ink on top of it, because you can print with an enamel paint effectively and then fire that enamel to get your design on it. So I'd be curious to find out if this is a traditional pad printing with regular ink, or if this is actually pad printed with an enamel. So that is one way that they're saving some money on these dials, by printing them instead of having separate physical numbers for the display. Yeah, I'm definitely going to try finding one of these to check out in person, because it's a great looking watch, and it certainly looks like it's worthwhile paying attention to.
Yeah, it may be hard to get your hands on. It's a limited edition. I imagine many of them will sell before they even hit the showcases in stores.
Good to know.
Seiko also released a thinner watch this year, the Seiko 6L. And thinner, more wearable watches seem to be a little bit in vogue this year. Another one that stood out to me was Tudor's Black Bay 58, which is certainly a much more wearable, as far as my own personal tastes go, version of the Black Bay. I found that the normal Black Bay is quite a bit too tall. This one is reminiscent to me of say, a Rolex 5508, which is one of the early Submariners. And if I had my choice of Submariners, if I were to wear a Submariner, the 55 would actually probably be my personal choice or go-to, just because I find it to be a much more wearable timepiece than the more modern ones. But that said, I wouldn't personally put my money down on a Black Bay 58 because it still seems just a touch too big for my own taste, but it's certainly more within the realm of reason for my wrist size. But that was a welcome change. There are a number of brands that were releasing watches that were smaller and more wearable for people with smaller wrists and targeted at ladies in a lot of cases. So it was refreshing compared to other years. Another thing with the Black Bay 58 is it's got some of, I guess we could call it fotina going on, where they try and make the watch look older than it actually is. And another one that made quite a splash, although it wasn't officially announced, was the Longines Military. Did you see any pictures of that?
Yeah, I haven't seen the Longines Military one. I haven't really checked that out. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of a lot of the stuff that Longines does. That one didn't get my attention by any means.
They did an admirable job in pulling off what they did and making it look as old as they did. I'm
not sure that I like that idea of pre-distressing stuff. I guess it's something that can be done for art pieces and things, but I'm not sure that I would want my watch to be pre-distressed or intentionally made to look old. I'm going to do a fine job of damaging it and beating it up while I wear it. So I think if I'm buying a watch, I want it to be, to be pristine. I guess it's sort of like people who buy pre-worn jeans. They want jeans that have already been worn by somebody and sort of pre-distressed, and I've never really understood that idea.
It's exactly the comparison I was going to bring up, is the pre-worn denim, which I thought for a time was just a fad, but it doesn't seem to have disappeared.
No, and people pay an incredible premium for these pre-worn jeans as well, which it's shocking to me. So anyway, I'm not a big fan of the idea. I haven't seen this watch in particular yet, but I'm not a big fan of this idea of pre-patinaing a watch.
Yeah, it's not my particular cup of tea, but I can understand what they're attempting to achieve. And I think it was actually summed up quite well in an open letter to the Swiss watch industry from a so-called frustrated millennial that was published on Watches by SJX a few weeks back. It was written by Brandon Moore, who I believe is a software developer living in Seattle.
Right.
And the way that he summed it up was that millennials want to love watches because they can transcend the increasingly rapid pace of change that permeates their lives. So by making watches that harken back to a slower period of time, say the 1950s, or a slower pace of life, it gives a sense of reprieve, I suppose, that pre-worn denim doesn't quite do.
Right.
I think it's just a nice clean break from the rapid pace of life today, living in this world saturated by social media and glowing slates of glass and all that.
Right.
Another piece that Longines announced this year that was a surprise to me, and I haven't heard many people talk about, is they announced an annual calendar. And what's most impressive to me about this announcement was the price point. So they're selling it for around 4,000 Swiss francs, which, to the best of my knowledge, is the cheapest that you can get an annual calendar in a mechanical timepiece from any brands anywhere at the moment.
Now, I'm used to hearing about people creating perpetual calendar movements, and that seems to be what gets a lot of focus. What exactly is an annual calendar?
So an annual calendar gives you kind of the best of a perpetual calendar in terms of the convenience, the side of things, without the complexity or price point of a perpetual calendar. So a perpetual calendar will automatically change the date for you at the end of the month to the first of the month, whether that month ends on the 30th, the 28th, or the 29th. Whereas an annual calendar will do essentially the same thing, but it will only account for months that end in 30 days. So every year, once a year, you have to change the date manually at the end of February, whereas a perpetual calendar will account for leap years for you. It will account for every single February to an extent. That's because our calendar system's quite complicated. And I find, like being mechanical timepieces, most owners of perpetual calendars wind up having to set their watches once or twice a year anyway, unless they're keeping it on a winder all the time. But then as well, you have a number of perpetual calendars that are manual wind and not automatic. So it's the sort of piece that you would need to be wearing every single day and winding every day if you don't want to have to go through the rigmarole of having to set the calendar. And setting the calendar system on a perpetual calendar is quite an involved process. And if you do it at the wrong time of day, you can end up causing quite a bit of damage depending on the make of the movement. There are some brands with a number of patents that prevent you from damaging the movement. But it's a very complex system, whereas an annual calendar is significantly simpler to set and comes in at a much more affordable price point. The first annual calendar I was aware of was made by Patek Philippe back in the 1990s. There are records in Breguet's archives of annual calendars, but to the best of my knowledge, those aren't annual calendars in the modern sense, but rather a calendar that would have displayed the month, the day of the week, as well as the date, and then occasionally, sometimes as well, the years, and tick those up for you too. But it's referring more to the display of having a full annual display rather than an annual calendar, which you can have in a really simple version, just the date window, and then say a small hand indicating the month, or having an aperture for both the month and the date. Now, Longines' sibling brand Omega also has an annual calendar that they released 2 years ago, but it comes in at twice the price of this new piece from Longines. And I would think that the next closest in price would be the MIH watch, designed by Ludwig Olschen, I believe is how you pronounce his name. And he now runs the brand Oxen Jr., but he designed a rather simple system for making an annual calendar for the MIH Museum. And that, I believe, you can actually still buy new today, and it's about 6,000 Swiss francs. But apart from those pieces, if you want to get into an annual calendar, you're looking at spending 5 figures or so. The Skydweller from Rolex, which also has an annual calendar system, it's around 15,000 Swiss francs to get the stainless steel version, I believe. And then anything from any other brand, whether it be Patek or Blancpain or what have you, you're getting well up into 5-figure territory to get your hands on an annual calendar. So this is a welcome complication from Longines, and I'm looking forward to getting under the dial of this timepiece when I have the opportunity.
I'm curious to see where they go with this. It is a nice complication to see. It's a bit better than just a standard date window, and the price point is perfect. So I'm happy to see them doing something that's a little bit different, that isn't some crazy expensive complication.
Now, a different timepiece from Omega that comes in at around the same price point as the Longines annual calendar that they announced this year is the Omega Seamaster 300, which harkens back to the Pierce Brosnan Bond era with the wave dial. But the interesting thing about the dial on this particular piece is that they have made it from ceramic, which in terms of any of the big brands, this is the first big brand I know of to have introduced a ceramic dial into a production timepiece.
The ceramic is starting to become more common for case design, but I don't know. I'm sure somebody's done a ceramic dial before, but I certainly haven't seen anything like this being used as a dial material.
Yeah, when the Pelagos was first announced, I actually wondered if the dial was made of ceramic when I first got my hands on one, because the bezel has a ceramic insert, and the dial is very closely matched to that, but it does not have a ceramic dial on it.
Right.
The first watch I had heard of with a ceramic dial, which was also announced the same month as Baselworld 2018, although not at Baselworld, was the Frodsham Double Impulse Chronometer, which is a very highly crafted, incredibly well thought through in the mechanical sense timepiece from Frodsham. And this is the first wristwatch they have made in, I believe, close to half a century. And incredibly well executed. And the late Derek Pratt, who we'll link to in the show notes as well, is an excellent watchmaker. Had quite a bit of influence on that particular project as well. And it's nice to see it finally come to fruition and now become available. But that is not at all within the same price bracket as the Seamaster 300 or the Longines annual calendar. But it also has the ceramic dial.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what people start to do with these ceramic dials, because it's a similar material in many ways to enamel. However, the process for making these ceramic dials and cases is very different than the enamels, and I'm curious to see what the limitations are of it. I don't think you're going to be able to get the same kind of translucency that you're getting out of the enamels. However, you can get very high polish out of them. So I'm curious to see how people innovate with that and how they can get the look and feel in some ways of the traditional enamel dials with this material, this sort of very advanced material that people are starting to use now. So
But it certainly has a leg up over painted dials in that they're not going to age in the same way that a painted dial would. So in the same way that you get an eternal look from an enamel dial, you can also get that now with the ceramic dials.
Right, you're not getting any of the effects of UV light on the paints or anything like that. And also these are going to be far more durable. So if for some reason there is an accident with it and there's some abrasion of some kind on the dial, it's nowhere near as susceptible to damage as a painted or printed dial would be.
And should be less susceptible to hairline fractures and the like as well. Most watch manufacturers use a zirconium-based ceramic. Generally, you're looking at a mix of aluminum oxide, which is essentially the same thing that the sapphire crystal on the front of most watches is made of. So you effectively need a diamond to scratch it. And then you mix in a bit of zirconium and some yttrium oxide as well. So the aluminum oxide provides you that scratch resistance that you're not going to get from enamel. And the zirconium brings the resilience that'll help prevent fractures and cracks. And then the yttrium oxide adds some stability to the mix.
One of the other big technical advantages of ceramic versus enamel is that with enamel, you're going to be applying the enamel onto some sort of a metal substrate. And because of the changes in coefficient of expansion between the enamel glass and the metal, you have to be very careful as you're applying the enamel and letting it cool. The enamel, the glass is shrinking at a different rate than the metal is. And while they try and match the enamels to the particular metal, you're always going to have that fight where as the glass cools, it's trying to pull in towards the center of that dial. And so you'll see that on the backside of enameled pieces, there's a counter enamel that's been applied to it. And that counter enamel is there so that it fights against the urge for the enamel on the front side of the piece to pull the metal out of being flat. The short-term effects of that when you're actually enameling is you can have cracks that show up within half an hour, minutes, or whatever of the piece cooling down from the kiln. And even if you don't have it crack sort of shortly after it comes out of the kiln, there are still a lot of stresses in that enamel, and you can then end up with cracking happening years later. So if you take a look at a lot of vintage enamel dials, you'll see hairline fractures, hairline cracks across the enamel dials. And a lot of that is actually coming from the the tension that's in that glass, and it eventually ends up cracking on you. So certainly one of the technical advantages of this is going to be that it isn't going to have those stresses. And I suspect because of that, they can also make it thinner. One of the problems with enameled pieces is that, first off, the larger the area of metal that you're going to enamel, the thicker the metal has to be to help it combat the warpage that you're going to get from the enamel shrinking. And then, of course, you have to put the counter enamel on the back. So you have the enamel layer on the front, the thickness of the metal, and then the enamel layer on the back, the counter enamel. And all of that does add up to a fair bit of thickness. And, of course, you only have so much room inside of these watches. So I suspect these dials are going to be much thinner than your average enamel dial will be.
Mm-hmm. And given that the material is as hard as it is when it comes to ceramic, the fact that Omega was able to get these wave patterns into the dial is quite impressive. And although they did not come right out and say it, I would imagine that for this particular model, they've employed a similar laser ablation technology that they use to create a very unique dial/movement concept for a limited edition of the Speedmaster that they announced this year. That's similar technology actually to what Apple has been using for at least the micro perfs all the way back in the original unibody Macs, where the indicator light would disappear into the aluminum when it wasn't on, and they've since evolved to use that technology from doing everything from deburring components post-processing after CNC machining to actually engraving the knurling on the aluminum versions of the Apple Watch crown. That's all done with lasers or laser ablation.
Yeah, and certainly this engraved style that they've done, that Omega has done on this dial, is not something that you could do easily with enamel either. The enamel really needs to be flat, and trying to do an engraved pattern like this just wouldn't be possible on enamel. At least I'm not aware of it being possible, just because, again, you'd have to figure out a way of cutting away that parts of that glass without affecting the rest of it, and without affecting the stresses in the glass as well, which is the real problem.
Now, another very unique dial, certainly not something I've seen before in terms of a date display, was the Nomos Neomatic. And you mentioned to me this particular piece stood out to you. What about it did you like in particular?
Yeah, one of the things I'll say to begin with is that I love what Nomos is doing with their brand, with their designs. First off, they're doing everything in-house, which is, or at least they're making all their movements in-house, which is nice to see. They're a relatively inexpensive brand in terms of companies that are doing everything in-house. They're not massive. They're obviously not a Rolex or anybody like that, but they are still doing everything in-house, and they're releasing things at a reasonable price. I'm a big fan of the simple design that they've chosen to stick with for their design language. It's a very simple, graphic, minimalist design. And one of the things they've excelled at over the years is finding different ways of indicating dates that don't complicate the dial very much. I'm not a big fan of date windows for the most part. And the reason why is because I find that most dates tend to clutter up the dial too much. This particular one is interesting. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody do something like this. Occasionally you'll see dials with the date around the outside of the dial, and there's a separate hand that indicates around the outside of the dial. And that is often a good look, and I do like that. I certainly prefer it over the little flipping date number that shows up usually near the 3 o'clock position. But they've gone a step further with this. Instead of having a separate hand that indicates the number of the month, they've gone off and they have small cutouts separating the numbers and little red indicators that will sort of light up either side of the number as the date changes. So on their website, you can see the 27th is the date, and you have these little red dashes on either side of the 27 to indicate that that's the day of the month. So I'm a big fan of the way they've done this. We don't really talk a lot about UX design in watches, the user experience. I think it's something that a lot of brands could actually do with is good UX or better UX design. And I think Nomos has done a spectacular job of introducing a date feature, which is often a poor user experience on a watch face, making it clean, making it simple, and making it very legible. It's very easy to figure out what the date is on this. So anyway, I'm a big fan of Nomos, and I'm certainly a big fan of the way that they've done this particular date design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've not seen a piece with this exact style of indicating the date, flanking the date the way that they've done. There have been a couple of other brands that have done something similar with the date disc underneath the dial, peeking up just as a dot. That would be a particular color versus all the other dots being a different color. Fossil was one, and there's another I can't remember off the top of my head that was created by a designer back in the mid-90s. That's certainly a very different user interface for displaying the date. I personally think there's still a little bit of room for improvement here, but it would require certainly some rethinking of the actual mechanics that are driving the date disc. Mm-hmm. But my hat's off to Nomos for finding a unique way to integrate the date into their Neomatic while still retaining the DNA that is Nomos, that Bauhaus aesthetic. And as you mentioned as well, they're doing everything in-house. This is with an in-house movement, and at this price point, it really is spectacular value for the money. I've been saying for years that Nomos is an underrated brand and an underappreciated brand, but they are certainly coming more and more to the fore. Now I'm certainly seeing them on more and more people's wrists, and I've certainly had more and more of them crossing my bench over the years.
Yeah, that's great to hear, because I'm happy to see that people are starting to appreciate what they're doing, and as you said, they're certainly one of the underappreciated brands out there.
Mm-hmm. Now, another very obscure brand, or unknown to many perhaps, is Garrick. And they are an English brand. And while the design is a little heavy-handed to my taste, certainly not of the Nomos aesthetic, they have also recently launched their own in-house caliber, and they announced at Basel this year the Garrick S1, which contained a movement that they are referring to as the UT-G01. Have you had a chance to take a look at this particular piece yet?
I've been following Garrick for a couple of years now, and I'm happy to see they're one of the brands who are starting to try and revive watchmaking in Britain again, which is great to see, because they were the sort of the timekeepers of the world at one point, and they were producing certainly the most innovative timepieces. In fact, we're recording this today on the 325th anniversary of John Harrison's birthday. Mm-hmm. And he of course being responsible for creating the marine chronometer and helping to solve the longitude problem. The British were certainly the world leaders in watch design, and it's nice to see various brands that are starting back up again, trying to bring watchmaking back into Britain. And while a lot of them, including Garrick, were designing their watches and having the movements made probably in Switzerland for the most part, it is nice to see them bringing the manufacturing of this movement back into the UK. Now, the particular design of this watch, I'm not a huge fan of the dial. It's certainly nice to see the movement, to see what they're doing with the movement. But I find, again, going back to the whole idea of the UX of a watch, I find this type of dial extremely difficult to read in person. And while I appreciate what they're doing, and I have a great deal of respect for them technically, I'm not a big fan of the dial on this watch, because I find it a little bit too busy.
And they haven't brought everything back over the pond to the UK from Switzerland. They've predominantly been basing their earlier pieces on the Unitas 6497 or 6498. I can't remember exactly which off the top of my head. And at first, I'd actually thought the UT in the UT GO1 stood for Unitas in a nod that way, and that I thought perhaps they were using the barrel and the wheels and say the setting works and whatnot. And there is a chance they might still be using some of those components in the UT GO1. But it turns out the UT actually stands for Urteil, which is the company run by independent watchmaker Andreas Strahler. And he is known for mostly his Papillon timepieces. He's done a number of unique pieces with mechanical memories, so to speak. So he will use cam systems similar to what you would see in, say, a split-second chronograph, but he would use those cams to keep track of other measurements of time, and say be able to have the hands of the watch flip to displaying the date and then immediately revert back to showing the time, or to switch from chronograph mode to, say, a time only mode and that sort of thing.
Right.
But he is in his own words, a watchmaker to the brands. So a lot of the stuff he has done, you would have no idea that he's actually been the one behind it, just because of NDAs and that sort of thing. But he and his company back in Switzerland are actually the ones behind the majority of the manufacturing of the pieces for this particular watch from Garrick. Now, to their credit, they are doing quite a number of other things themselves in-house. As far as I know, that the free-sprung balance, which my hat's off to them for including a free-sprung balance in their piece. I believe they are doing all of that themselves in the springing and the timing and the adjustment and a bunch of the finishing. And again, they're finishing. You've got some nicely finished interior corners and whatnot. So they've
looking at the back of this watch, and it has a nice crystal on the back to be able to see into the movement, and they're obviously referencing back to traditional British timepieces. They've got large plates, and they're using chatons for the jewels, and the nicely blued screws and gold plated bridges and plates and whatnot. I do like the aesthetics of it. I like the sort of the simple look of it without being. I guess some of these watches, when you look at the movements, they are a bit gaudy when you look at the engraving that's being done on them. But this, I like the simple look of it. Again, it's in fact, I actually prefer the back of this watch over the front of it. I think it looks better than the front. But anyway, it's I do like the look of it. I do like what they're doing with it, and hopefully we'll see more and more of this happening, and more of the manufacturing coming back over to the UK as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, from a movement perspective, an absolute standout piece for me was a piece from Acrivia, which was their chronometre contemporain, which they're actually labeling Rexep Rexepi, which is the older of the two brothers behind the brand. And both fairly young watchmakers, but they both know what they're doing. They're phenomenal watchmakers and creators. And the layout of this movement is incredibly well balanced and well conceived.
Yeah, I've been following these two on Instagram for a few years now, and I'm always struck by not only how technically impressive the watches are and the movements are, but also how beautiful the aesthetics of their movements are. Mm-hmm. They always have these well balanced movements. In fact, the movements are often works of art from the point of view of them being, well shaped and whatnot. So I've been a big fan of their work for a few years now, and I love the look of this watch. The dial sort of hides just how complex this watch is in the background, and how how well designed the movement is. And it would be easy to look at this on somebody's wrist and quickly dismiss it as being sort of a fairly boring watch. So this is a bit of an understated watch in terms of what it looks like when you're wearing it. But when you start looking at the the close-up photos of the finishing and the details that are in this movement. It's certainly a beautiful example of how to design and finish a watch movement.
And keep in mind too, like, these are photos of a prototype. This isn't even the final product yet, and the level of finish that they've hit
Absolutely.
on a prototype piece is just staggering, really.
And all of their work is the finishing, the level of finishing on their work is always spectacular. But you're right, this is a prototype that they brought to the show, and it is just gorgeous, the work that they put into it and the way that it looks. So unfortunately, these are well out of the range of anything that I'm going to be able to afford, but they are absolutely stunning watches. And if you're looking for an interesting watch in this sort of price range, I would highly recommend looking at these. They're gorgeous watches, and they're definitely for sort of the watch collector's watch collector. It's one of those things that not many people will understand that what you're wearing on your wrist, but those who do will really appreciate it.
And I appreciate too that it is a chronometer grade piece, because that balance wheel is daringly close to the pinion of the center wheel there. And if I didn't know it was a chronometer, which means it's going to be a piece that's going to keep phenomenal time for a mechanical timepiece, I would be concerned about just how close that balance wheel is running there. But I believe them when they say it's a chronometer. So it's going to keep impeccable time, and they've just really nailed the aesthetics on that movement. So for me, this is a piece where I absolutely I like the movement side far more than the face side.
Agreed.
That's just an exquisite timepiece.
This might be the watch that I like the most out of this year's Baselworld, just in terms of the looks of it. And again, I tend to prefer a slightly understated dial versus some of the craziness of the more complex dials. And like the last one that we were talking about there, the Garrick S1, I much prefer the dial on this versus the Garrick. So I think this has to be one of my favorite watches from this year.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject of exquisite finish and balance wheels, Voutilainen wasn't so much announced at Baselworld in that I believe it sold before Basel even hit. But Kari Voutilainen made another decimal repeater. I believe it's his 12th decimal repeater. And this one is the only one to date to come with a regulator dial. And it was sold through the Hourglass in Singapore. But it also is just incredibly well finished. Just another beautifully conceived and executed movement. It says built on a vintage Bosch, but Voutilainen has made a number of changes to the movement. One being the governor for the repeating works is actually a flywheel style governor, which would not have been original to this piece. Originally, this would have had something more akin to an escapement that would have been regulating how quickly the chimes would sound. And the unfortunate thing about that latter style that I mentioned is that you get a bit of a chattering sound that intermingles with the chimes, whereas with the flywheel style governor that Voutilainen has retrofit onto this will run absolutely silently, so all you hear are those nice, clean, crisp chimes. And another area that he has updated on this piece is he has given it a free-sprung balance, much like a Krivia and Garrick. But the interesting thing here, which I haven't seen him do in any other piece, is he has a combination of gold and titanium inertia blocks for the fine adjustment of the piece. And I was a little perplexed by this at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how clever it is for really fine adjustment. Because with the gold inertia blocks, a very small degree of movement can have a relatively large impact on the order of seconds, whereas the titanium being quite a bit lighter means it'll be more forgiving in terms of how far you can adjust those inertia blocks. So to get really, really fine timekeeping on the level of sub-second adjustments, having those titanium inertia blocks is really a very smart idea, and I can see now why he would have done that, and that's a nice touch on that piece as well.
This is based on a vintage ebosh. Are you saying that this is actually a single vintage movement that he has then refinished and modified for his purposes, or is this something where he's taken that design from the vintage movement and rebuilt it entirely for himself?
So your first inclination was correct. This is actually a vintage caliber. This particular one would have been made close to 100 years ago. It's a Louis Elise Piguet caliber. His grandson would have been the founder of Frédéric Piguet, which has since been purchased by the Swatch Group and rolled into Blancpain, I believe. And a number of his other decimal repeaters were built on Lecoutre eboches. And if you wanted to yourself, at the moment, as we're recording this, you can actually pick up almost an identical base caliber on eBay for about $10,000 from Russia, rather than dropping the $325,000 that it would cost you to get this particular decimal repeater from Kari-Voutilainen. And then you can put all the blood, sweat, and tears into converting it into the level of finish and detail that he has poured into this particular piece, and make yourself a nearly $500,000 Canadian timepiece.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the level of skill that Kari does when it comes to modifying old movements and turning them into something like this. And certainly for $10,000, I'm not going to shell out that kind of money for a movement that I'm then going to hack apart and change into something else. I'll do that for a movement that's maybe a tenth of that price, but that's a little bit rich for my blood.
Mm-hmm. Very few independent watchmakers have made a minute repeater from scratch. Daniels has done it. Pigeon has, and then Christophe Claret was just a master of chiming movements and has made a number of the pieces that you'll find in much bigger brands. Now, another bit of follow-up, actually, from our chat about Kari-Voutilainen in our SIHH episode. I had mentioned that the 217 QRS, which was his retrograde calendar timepiece that he announced there, was a bit of a mouthful in terms of the naming of the piece. But I've since deduced that there is logic behind that reference, and that the 217, as with a number of his other pieces, is referencing the year that the caliber was conceived. So it's 2017 without the zero. And the QRS would stand for Quantième Rétrograde Seconde. So a retrograde calendar with seconds. And QP, which you'll see referenced in things like Salon QP, which is both a magazine and a watch event that occurs in London each autumn. The QP there, if it seems a little peculiar, stands for Quantième Perpétuel, which is perpetual calendar. And for more from Voutilainen himself, to hear a bit about what it is like for him and in his day-to-day work and his thinking and the values that he has, I would really recommend checking out the Keeping Time podcast, the latest episode from Oster Watches out of Denver. And they had the opportunity to get Voutilainen on the line and chat with him for close to an hour about his work and his history. And it was very insightful to hear straight from the man himself, and quite a rare interview as well, because it's not often that you hear directly from Voutilainen.
I was going to say, I don't think I've seen a lot of interviews with him or heard a lot of interviews with him, and the few that I've found on YouTube have been excellent. So I'm definitely going to check that out, because he always has interesting things to say, and I always appreciate his view of what he does and the work that he's doing. Now, we've been talking about a lot of the more normal watches, I guess you would say, in terms of how they're designed and sort of traditional in terms of their movements and things like that. There is a side of the industry that tends to go a little bit crazy with watch designs, and I think this year it's been exemplified with the Grubel Forsey quad tourbillon movement. Now, a tourbillon is an impressive complication to add to a watch as it is. It takes a fair bit of engineering skill and manufacturing skill to design a good tourbillon and then build it. And people over the years have done all sorts of weird things with them. They've made 3D tourbillons and all these different designs. And this year, Grubel Forsey has created a quad tourbillon. So there's actually 4 tourbillon escapements in this watch, helping to regulate the time and keep it more accurate. I have to wonder, how many of these things do we actually need in here to help regulate the time better? There must be a point where it's just like, this is getting kind of ridiculous in terms of the amount of extra work that's going into it. It must be a relatively small gain in terms of the accuracy that you're getting out of this watch with the additional escapements. I will say that fortunately when they made this, it is certainly one of the better looking of these crazy watches. Oftentimes they're pretty crazy in terms of their case design because they're trying to fit in all of these tourbillons and their weird motion and whatnot. So they've done a reasonable job of designing a nice looking case for this. I'm not sure that I'm a fan of this particular trend of these crazy movements. What do you think about 4 tourbillon movements in this watch?
I didn't realize that Grubel Forsey was even exhibiting at Basel this year. I thought they had only exhibited at SIHH. I am familiar with their quadruple tourbillon. On the subject of multiple tourbillons or multi-axis tourbillons or just tourbillons in general, to me are becoming more and more of a showpiece, more of an anachronism, particularly when you look at the kind of performance that the likes of Rolex and Patek are able to hammer out these days. And like every single Rolex coming off the line now with their green seal has guaranteed rate of -2 to +2 seconds per day. And in reality, when you drop one of these watches on a time machine, you're looking at flat lines and 0 in nearly every position. So
Sure.
they just completely obliterate any rationale for a tourbillon. And the tricky thing with a tourbillon is you have to be careful about the errors that you are introducing with a tourbillon, because you are all of a sudden introducing a whole bunch of other factors that can throw a wrench in things in terms of your timekeeping performance. Now, Grubel Forsey, to their credit, are particularly well known for putting the time and effort in to actually make their tourbillons perform well. Patek as well. They take tourbillons seriously, and you typically look at about plus or minus a second a day coming out of a tourbillon from Patek Philippe. And Grubel Forsey as well has won a number of chronometer competitions in recent years with their tourbillons. And actually the whole reason that they introduced the dual axis tourbillon was to overcome some of the problems of having a single axis tourbillon, in that the single axis would only account for changes in the vertical positions. So it would average out, theoretically, changes in the verticals, but not in the horizontal positions.
Right.
Whereas throwing in this extra tilt inside of a tourbillon, effectively, they're able to account for just about any axis you would wear the watch in and average things out that way. And then what they're doing by introducing a second of these nested tourbillons is then trying to average out your daily variance from those using a differential. But I mean, the more parts and components you add, the more potential points of failure you have. So to put things into a bit of context, there are a number of tourbillons from a number of brands who do not take the art of timekeeping as seriously. And for them, the tourbillon is simply
it's a gimmick.
A showplace. It is a gimmick. And their tolerances for some of these pieces is like minus 30 to plus 30 seconds a day.
Oh, wow.
Which, I mean, your cost timekeeping standard is minus 4 to plus 6. And you can get
Sure.
that out of a standard $200 at a movement with the right adjustments. So it's dropping 5 figures on a tourbillon isn't particularly justified if it's not going to keep time like
Sure.
that. So it is more and more, I would say, a showpiece.
I guess it's becoming a bit like the 0 to 60 times in the car world, where it gets to a point, if you're accelerating faster than a certain point, you're what's the reason for that? Like it's just a number that they're showing off, or the top speed of a car. They're just sort of showing off that they can do it, as opposed to it being something that's practical anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ludicrous mode in a Tesla is it's actually painful. It's like getting punched in the face. It's not something to brag about, really.
Yeah, when you're getting whiplash from your car, it's and this seems to me to be the same kind of thing. You're not getting whiplash from it, but it just seems to be a little bit ridiculous. So I will say that I do love the particular blue that they've managed to get for this dial. I don't know how they're doing it. I don't know what the finishing technique is for this particular dial. But the combination that they have here of the blue with the rose gold, and also they've got a black with rose gold. The colors of the dials and the case are absolutely stunning, and they've done a great job in that. I'm not a huge fan of their hands, but that's a different thing altogether. But the color combinations they've got for this are gorgeous. I'm a big fan of blue and gold together, and certainly the rose gold looks great with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two of the more over the top and showy tourbillons that jump to mind for me are the tourbillon of tourbillons by Antoine Preziuso, which is effectively a spinning disc of 3 tourbillons all together on different axes. Another one is the Cobedins, which their claim to fame is that it's the largest tourbillon in a wristwatch. And what points out to me just the egregiousness of that particular design is just looking at the hairspring breathing on this thing. You can tell that they are not taking chronometry seriously in the least, because you are not going to get nice isochronistic performance out of a tourbillon with a hairspring breathing like that. If any tourbillon I see that does not have an overcoil hairspring or one of the newer silicon hairsprings that compensate for concentricity in the actual physical architecture of the spring, and a tourbillon that has a pin regulated balance as opposed to a free sprung balance. Either of those,
they're not taking that seriously.
A dead ringer that this is not a serious tourbillon, but just a little ballet for your wrist.
Sure. Now, something that wasn't released at Baselworld this year, but something I've just come across recently, thanks to a Jack Forster article, is the Crayon Everywhere watch. So the claim to fame for this watch that makes it really interesting is that it shows you the sunrise and sunset times any day of the year, which is something that a number of companies have done before. You can use, using a series of cams, you can design a clock or a watch for a particular latitude. You can set the cam to show off the exact time of sunrise and sunset at that particular latitude. But what these guys have gone a step farther, and they've introduced the ability to program any latitude into the watch, and it will accurately display the sunrise and sunset times any day of the year, which is incredibly impressive. I don't know that I've seen anybody do that even in a clock mechanism. Pulling this off in a watch mechanism is incredibly impressive. I would love to see how they've managed to do that, because, as I said, most people use a set cam to indicate the sunrise and sunset time. So I would love to see how they're programming this thing, because it is literally programmed. You set the date, the time, the latitude, and you can get all of the accurate sunrise sunset times on your watch. So it's a good looking watch. It's a little bit busy, but obviously they're showing off a lot of material or a lot of information on the watch face. It's also a 24-hour watch dial as opposed to a traditional 12-hour watch dial, so it's a little bit different for some people. But I am incredibly impressed with the technical challenge that they've taken on and what they've managed to accomplish with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Sunrise and sunset complications are among my favorite complications for a timepiece. And in terms of a UX side of things, I tried to, probably more than a decade ago now, nudge ASU Lab, who's the research and development arm of the Swatch Group, who were the brains behind the Tissot T-Touch, tried to nudge them to include a sunrise and sunset feature for the T-Touch line, because they can very easily change the position of the hour and minute hands on those timepieces. So it'd be a fairly trivial complication to add to that lineup, but that is not, to the best of my knowledge, a complication, so to speak, that has ever entered any of Tissot's Touch line of watches. But I very much admire the technical chops that it took for them to pull this off, and I'm very curious to see how they actually achieved this in the Crayon Everywhere, because to do this mechanically versus digitally, which is how things would have been done in a T-Touch, they have somehow managed to do this 100% with just gears and cogs, and I would imagine some form of cam. And the actual display, to me, reminds me of the sunrise and sunset complication on the Star Caliber 2000 from Patek Philippe, which is a Grail watch I will never own, and if I did own, would probably never wear. But rather than just have it a semicircle, they do the full circumference of the dial.
I like the way they've decided to project the sunrise and sunset times onto the dial. I think they've done a great job of that. The minute hand and hour hands are also well done. I like their choice of showing off the hours. That's a nice view, and I think it works well with the particular sunrise and sunset display they've done. In some ways, this reminds me a bit of the watch that Hajime Asaoka designed a few years ago. He created he's one of the members of the AHCI, one of the independent makers. He's a Japanese watchmaker. He decided to take a traditional Japanese timekeeping principle where the number of hours of daylight and the number of hours of darkness are equal. So there's always, let's say, 6 hours of daylight every day, and there's always 6 hours of darkness every day. And the length of each hour changes as the time of year changes. So you'll see the hours sort of move, the hour hands sort of move around a bit. Fascinating design, and he was able to take this traditional Japanese clock complication and put it into a watch, using a series of cams for that. There's a great YouTube video that talks about it, and I'll put a link to that YouTube video in the show notes. It's worth watching. In fact, it's him preparing the prototype leading up to Baselworld a few years ago. Any of these complications where you're changing something like this as the sort of the year goes on, or in a mechanical mechanism, is fascinating to see. I love seeing people take on these challenges and do them, because they're trivial for us to do in the digital world, but doing them in a mechanical world is a whole other level of design challenge, and it's nice to see.
Another handful of pieces that really impressed me from Baselworld this year were the marquetry dial watches from Patek Philippe. Patek Philippe's Métier d'Art division came out swinging this year at Basel. They've really delivered on a number of levels, from enamel through to their marquetry dials. And marquetry is the art of basically crafting pictures out of small fragments of wood that are cut and shaped to mesh perfectly together to create an image. And they have a pocket watch with a leopard on it that from a distance you would think was a painting or a drawing, but once you get up close you realize that every little spot, all the little contours, every bit of shading, it's all done with different pieces of wood from different types of trees to lend the different colors and grains to the piece. And I just can't imagine the number of hours that would have been poured into making a piece like that. They also did a two watches with mountainscapes and one with a pair of climbers on them. And they're just all really phenomenally well done.
Yeah, these particular watches are certainly not my style. I would never, even if I had the money for them, I don't think I would ever look at buying these watches. But the technical skill that's involved in designing these and then making these, rendering these images, again, using these tiny pieces of wood, absolutely remarkable what they've been able to do with it. And even looking at a high res image of it, it's difficult to imagine that it's being rendered using small pieces of wood because it is absolutely immaculate and just looks fabulous what they've done with them.
I have a very deep respect for marquetry artists, which was, I would say, instilled in me after a trip to the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. Right. And I was more enamored by the floors in a number of the galleries than I was by the actual art on the walls. Just the amount of craftsmanship that went into the marquetry work on the floors in the Hermitage, and just the sheer square footage is just mind-rendingly impressive. And people are just, walking all over it and not minding at all what they're treading on. Yeah.
Anybody who's doing this kind of work is doing. I have a deep respect for what they're able to do. It's not what I'm keen on, but it's incredibly impressive what they're doing.
And one final note, just to wrap things up on, not specifically related to horology, although somewhat tangentially and most certainly related to art, is that I learned just recently that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has recently opened up their archives, not only of high-res images of a number of the pieces that they have on display, on the order of thousands of pieces, but also their collection of books available for digital download. And they do have several books that detail both a number of clocks and watches in their collection there at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but also just on the history and the provenance in general of timekeepers. So those are all free to download and look great on an iPad. And they've got just a range of books covering a wide variety of artistic subjects. Another one that jumped out at me that I think you and Tamara may find interesting, Chris, is one on illuminated manuscripts or illuminations, which I think we'll probably do a show on it at some point in time.
We will, and I was going to say the Met has always been one of the leaders in terms of releasing high quality images of their illuminated works. We've done a fair bit of study of illuminated documents and calligraphy and whatnot in the past, and also have made recreations of a few of these pieces, and the Met has always been one of the leaders in terms of making those images available, even before they were putting them up, sort of wholesale on their site. If you contacted them, they were always very good about getting good quality images of their work to you if you were looking for them. So I'm happy to see that they've started adding their book collection to it as well, and hopefully we see more museums doing this, because there's so much great knowledge like that in the world that's hiding in museums that people can't necessarily get to. So it's worth encouraging museums to keep doing this.
Yeah, most of these books as well, it would be to acquire a physical copy of them would cost you a few $100s, particularly for ones like the Illuminations. And it's absolutely free to download and peruse. And yeah, I just think it's a phenomenal initiative on their part.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.